Hello and welcome to the second Wet Cement Press kitchen table reading. So glad to see you guys all here. Some familiar faces, some new names, and it's great that you could all make it. So I'm Thoreau Lovell, the publisher of Wet Cement Press, which is a new press based here in Berkeley, California. Last year we did 5 books. This year I think we're on track to do 3, 4, 5, maybe again. So for more information about us and about the books, you can go to our website, which is wetcementpress.com. And we're also on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, which I forgot to mention last time. And it would be great to connect with you guys on those platforms as well. All right, so I think we've covered all of that. This is the second reading we've done on Zoom. So we're feeling a little bit more confident with Zoom, but nevertheless, please bear with us because things can always go wrong. So we're doing our best, and I think it's going to work out fine, but you never know. So with that out of the way, let's get started. Today's readers are Barbara Roether, who may be reading, I should say, from her Wet Cement Press book, Saraswati's Lament, and Brit Washburn, whose book, Notwithstanding, we brought out last year as well. And I'm pretty sure both Barbara and Brit will be reading new material as well. We appreciate your support being here, and I know Barbara and Britt really appreciate your support. One way to really show that support is to go ahead and order a copy of their books. If you do that now or the next couple weeks, you can get 15% off if you go to the Wet Cement Press website and enter this promo code, Kitchen Table 2. And if you forget the promo code, don't worry about it. Just go to our website /discounts and you'll see all of the current promo codes there. So, you know, in these difficult topsy-turvy times when everything is uncertain, you know, when we long for a return to normalcy and maybe even fear returning to normal, the old normal a little bit, it's important to think about what we can do to help other people. And being a press, what we can do is to provide a warm and welcoming place to gather together to listen to some amazing writers read their work. So that's what we're here for. I'm going to introduce both readers up front, and then they're going to each read in sequence. So they're going to read for about 15 minutes, and there's going to be a little bit of a dialogue between the two of them in between. So our first reader is Britt Washburn. Britt was born and raised in northern Michigan and educated at the Interlochen Arts Academy, the New School, University of Hawaii, Goddard College, and she works as a writer, editor, indexer, cook, and baker, and lives in Asheville, North Carolina with her 4 children. Britt has had poems published in numerous journals, and we published her first full-length book of poetry, Notwithstanding, in 2019. Our second reader is my good friend and fellow editor, Barbara Roether. Barbara was born and raised in Ohio, but lived most of her adult life in or around San Francisco. She frequently reviews books and writes about faraway places whenever she can. She's an itinerant Montessori school teacher who has lived and worked in Morocco, Bali, and most recently in Tokyo. Her novel, This Earth You'll Come Back To, was published by McPherson and Company in 2015, and Wet Cement brought out her poetry collection, Saraswati's Lament, in 2019. So please welcome both Britt Washburn and Barbara Roether, who are joining us from Asheville, North Carolina. The first reader will be Britt. Britt.
Thank you so much, Thoreau, and thank you all for being here. I can and can't see some of your faces, which is a mixed blessing. It's wonderful to see human beings just generally after these months of quarantine, and also a little overwhelming and disorienting. We were saying briefly as we gathered that unlike a local reading where you could predict the 3 familiar faces that were likely to turn out, this is a little more of an unknown, but thank you all for being here. I am going to begin by reading some new work. As some of us have discussed, the quarantine has been sort of wonderful for those among us who would choose to keep closer to home, and it's also been a very productive time in some respects. I think for me, there's a close correlation between how much time I have to read and how much I write. And so it's not necessarily about having more time to write, but having more time to read, which is so generative. So without going on too much longer, I'll just begin. This is called Making Donuts During Quarantine. First, measure raw sugar into a blender. Add dried lavender and lemon zest. Pulse until a fragrant dust begins to rise from the machinery. Set this aside for at least a few hours, or better yet, a month. It's okay if you haven't planned accordingly. It's okay if you haven't planned. Use this time to make a cup of tea. Let it steep. Breathe. Proceed. Once you can wait no longer, stir vinegar into almond milk. Allow it to curdle. Add melted coconut oil, vanilla, sifted flour, salt, leavening. Every regret that can't be buried out back, burned in a bonfire, sent downriver without a raft. While they bake, the scent will waft through the house like linens laundered and line dried, tied together to make the rope you've shimmied down. A note left by the cooling rack saying, take and eat. This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Beginning anew. First thing in the morning, pull a jacket over your nightdress, slip bare feet into clogs, carry the garbage out, its heft the weight of all the refuse of the week. Roll the dumpster to the curb, grateful a bear hasn't gotten there first, not this time. Notice the air, cool and fresh as water from a spring, birdsong like church bells, or the train whistle you laid awake listening to the night before, wondering where it might be going and if you might ride along, imagining another country, another century, a grandmother you never knew who, too, must have grown bored and tired of her chores and dolorous until something gave her pause. And she looked around and listened and felt overcome by a tenderness toward the newborn day. How labor affords its own consolation, its own euphoric. The grass wet with dew, the paving stones spaced exactly to match your stride as you walk back toward the house, back into its warmth, back into your life. I have scribbled little notes about these poems and, possible revisions, but I think I'm going to refrain from reading those and just forge forward. I should say that a lot of these poems were in response to prompts offered by my dear friend and fellow poet and teacher, Holly Wren Spalding, who runs a sort of workshop poetry incubator called Poetry Forge out of Southern Maine. I highly recommend her work and her teaching. Windfall. A budding branch blown down by last night's storm lies on the lawn, reminding me of a fawn my daughter and I came upon on the lake road once last summer. Perfectly intact, its back dappled like this morning's light through the draping wisteria vines, wet with rain, its eyes closed, its legs tucked in as if asleep or in the womb, though its doe was nowhere to be found. And she asked, my daughter did, who made her dead? And she won't ever grow up to be a mother. Why will she never be a mother? And she wept, it seemed, less for this small thing at our feet than for the future that would not be. This child of 3 you'd think couldn't see beyond next week. As I can't these days, our path as indiscernible as that of the wind, forever turning on a dime, bringing down someone or something that was just yesterday alive. I think I have just 3 more, so that's about the halfway point. I'm reading a half dozen from a little more than twice that I've written over the course of the past couple of months, which is, I think, about 6 times my typical rate. I'm lucky if I write a dozen poems a year. Talking with Barbara and Thoreau about that being sort of, if I could manage that, I was doing well this last decade. And so this is really unprecedented. And of course, it remains to be seen how many of these will hold up in the aftermath, but they've been good company. We were also talking about a little video of Louise Glick that I happened upon recently, in which she talks about drafts of poems being these like crummy little things that we carry around the house for us and that wait for us and that we look forward to coming home to. And we sort of remember there's this crummy little thing that we can climb into bed with. And yeah, dear. The mornings are cool here, the light gray, but it warms throughout the day, and most afternoons the sun appears. At the end of the road, there's a bank of lilacs in bloom. Out walking, I smell them as I round the bend and remember how furious my mother was when my father uprooted the bushes around our house on West Street. I never knew why and should ask him or her while I still can, before the source of every rift becomes a mystery, and all we know is that it's there and permanent, a scar that never fades and seems instead to darken over time. Though we've forgotten the injury and how it came to be, the distance between us growing like the length of the days, longer and longer until before we know it, it's late evening and we've yet to eat, yet to call the children in, gather the laundry from the line, water the garden, pause to take a drink from the hose, taste the mineral bittersweet of the well, as though it were a fountain that could turn back the hours, the years, so that we might do it all over again, more carefully, pay closer attention. I hope this finds you holding up, enjoying the spring where you are, the return of birds and green and all things prodigal, prodigious. Take good care and love always. The radical hospitality of the body. And this has an epigraph from Evan Boland, who I'm sure all of you know we just lost. Boland writes, all the signs we know are only ways of coming to our senses. The radical hospitality of the body. They beckon, the light on the low bookshelf at dawn, the sound of mocking birds greeting the day, the smell of bread toasting, warming the house where the morning air feels cool and the first sip of water tastes of kindness. Notice us, they seem to beg. Come to us and we will save you from yourself, that black hole in your head where ghost thoughts taunt the cowering child. They promise you are safe. They do not deceive you. Even as they dull with age, blur, fade, still they will bring you back to the world where you belong. Gracious hosts saying, here, come in, stay. Please, have a seat. Let us get you a drink, a bite to eat. You must be weary. Put up your feet. Tell us of your journey. We're listening. And this is the last of the new poems that I'll read. Thank you again for being here and for listening. Lament. I don't remember anyone ever telling me how quickly eyesight fades. Though when I mention it now, how in just these last weeks, words have blurred, it's been confirmed. Visions, precipitous diminishment, and, my mother suggests, the rest can go as swiftly. Climbing steps, getting dressed, the skills we learned as children and infants disappearing in reverse. Running, jumping, balance. Speech and language, walking, standing, feeding ourselves, the pincer grip, rolling over, lifting our heads, everything but being held, lulled, kissed on the fontanelle, whispered to in sing-song tones, the rhythm of another heartbeat. Then silence. Thank you. It's so quiet with everyone muted. Then silence.
Yeah, it's a fantastic reading though. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah. I am so happy to finally be able to read with you, Britt. In January, Britt and I had planned to do a reading together, and then just a few weeks before that, I had the opportunity to do some work in Tokyo, which I took. So I had to flee and give up my reading with Britt and give up some other events that I really wanted to attend. So this is lovely to have you all here, to have friends from far away that I haven't seen in a long time, and we really appreciate having all of you in our new virtual world, which has its closenesses even through its distance. We wanted to just give you a little sample, in addition to new work, to some of the work that is in the that are in the Wet Cement books that each of us have. So what I wanted to do is ask Britt to share a poem from her book, Notwithstanding, this lovely book. And then I wanted to just share a bit in terms of responding. I wanted to share what it was particularly in Britt's work, in certain pieces of Britt's work that so delights me, really. I find all of her work incredibly clear and elegant and a pleasure to listen to, but there's a few things in particular that I'd like to comment on. So Britt, would you mind reading behind door number 3? Page 89 it's called I'm Not Making This Up. Okay.
This is a surprise to me. So this is, I mean, it sort of relieves the pressure of having to choose, and also, yeah. I'm not making this up. Somewhere along the interstate between my old life and the new, I come upon a hearse marked Gamble on a placard in the back window. And I wonder if and how I'm supposed to interpret this dream, the one in which I'm seeking higher ground, fleeing the floodplain for the mountains, familiar perils for certain death. For death is certain, sooner or later, yours and mine. And I'm afraid I won't be able to make it back to you in time, that you'll die alone as I found you, reasonably content, but not ecstatic, as we were together briefly. Every love song ours to sing along to in the Jeep, the rag top down, or to dance to around the living room. And you would sometimes say, with tears in your eyes, I'm so happy, as if you were surprised, as if you knew it would not last. Though to be fair, you've said the same with equal feeling before meals of bread and cheese, a bottle of red wine breathing, the evening sun, the trees.
Thank you, Britt. I love that poem so much. And
It sounds like we need
someone else is talking.
might be Blake and Tess who need to be muted just for the reading. It's possible, like your little voices.
We don't know how to mute ourselves.
Oh, relatives, how lovely. I think you can mute them, Thoreau, right? That's okay. Anyway, this poem is one of many that has a quality that I find myself in my older age, older, not old, of course, really looking for in poetry and all literature, which is this sense of the reader, or rather the writer, discovering the poem as it's going along. And I feel like this poem has a couple places where that happens, that I'm not making it up. This is what I saw. And I love that quality, especially at the end. We have this wonderful scene of the lovers, and I'm so happy, as if you were surprised, as if you knew it would not last. And then this total change, which makes me love this poem, which is, though to be fair, you've said the same thing with equal feeling before meals of bread and cheese. It's that sense of being witness to something fantastic and inexplicable, and then thinking the next moment that maybe it wasn't that interesting after all. Or maybe it was, but in some other way. And I love that presence of the poet in the poem. So that was just.
Well, I appreciate that. And the only thing I'd like to say, and it will require that I step away for 2 seconds, it will be very brief. Thank you for indulging me, but I'm of course grateful and honored to have all of you here. But I can't read that poem and see Thomas Lynch in the audience without recommending his book, which says more and with more about death and dying and living and meals of bread and cheese and wine than I ever will or could. This is on my bedside table. I've been reading it aloud at night. I've been reading this book for as long as it's been out, probably 25 years at least. And so with that in mind.
What's the title of the book?
This is called The Undertaking.
Thank you.
And yes, I can't recommend it highly enough. And I'm very grateful to have Thomas Lynch here this afternoon.
Maybe his undertaker has a placard called "Gamble" in the back of it.
You can't make these things up. I just read aloud "The Right Hand of the Father." Many of these appeared, I think, in the London Review of Books or the New York Review of Books, and I discovered them there. Thomas Lynch happens to be from Michigan, as I am, but that was sort of sheer coincidence in the case of coming upon his work. And shall I ask you to read a poem now, Barbara? I have a few in mind. We could go back and forth. How would you?
Coerced into reading a poem.
Barbara's book from Wet Cement Press is called Saraswati's Lament, and this reading has given me an excuse, not that I've ever needed one, to go back to it and make the difficult decisions of what I might ask her to read given this opportunity. And maybe to begin, Barbara, if you could go to page 51.
51.
And read to us Nasi, the rice goddess.
Oh, yes, yes. Okay. So I think, as I've sort of already stated, I periodically go off to other countries and help Montessori schools set up their programs. And this was a year written during a year I got to spend in Bali. And this was written as I was, riding around the island. So it's called Nasi, the rice goddess. I'm sorry, I have to take my glasses off. In the afternoon, longing for greenery, I ride my motorbike to Umalas, the district at the edge of town, where a narrow raised roadway cuts between two rice fields. Today, two women in straw volcano hats are working at the harvest. Stooped among the bundles on the roadside, they are throwing the rice from their baskets up into the winnowing wind, then laughing with abandon as the chaff snows down on their heads and shoulders. How golden are the cut stalks still standing, and the smell of the field, so pungent with what has been given.
Thank you, Barbara.
That was one of the last rice fields in the beleaguered island of Bali, which is so overcome with tourists and crowds that the traditional way of life there really struggles to keep a little foothold. So it's always a little sad to think of, but yeah.
I'm so appreciative just of this gesture, which I think, or impulse that I would almost say drives all poems. There's this in the afternoon longing. And one of the first poems I was charged with memorizing as a student, I think in a workshop when I was 15, was the Song of Wandering Angus, which is Yeats. I went out to the Hazelwood because a fire was in my head and cut and peeled and so forth. And so this, you know, something was happening internally. And so I moved. And so I went out and looked around. And I think in this case, there's this sort of the longing for greenery, and then ultimately you come back to gold. You go looking for green and you come back with gold. But in the middle, in the heart of this poem, I guess you could sort of see it on the page, but there's an interesting structure in what is sort of the fourth stanza. It's like the stanza 3.5, in which there are these increasingly indented lines that sort of enact the winnowing wind and the shaft snowing down, and the delight of these women as they work. And I think one of the poems that I read, I think there's a line about labor affording its own consolation, and that's totally stolen, as is everything I've ever written. In that case, I think in part from a writer named Michael Hannon, who wrote I think this was in a book called Ordinary Messengers, and there's a little persona poem from the perspective of a mole, and the mole says, "Work is my salvation." And I think, work is all of our salvation, and if not our own work, the work of others, and that's what we're seeing here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I love that line, and I had jotted it down when you said it, labor is its own consolation, which perfectly describes this poem that I wanted to read. And I wish I had that line a few hours ago as I was revising this, because it's just sort of not the conclusion, but something that I wanted to come to. So I think I'll go off and read another poem. This poem, like Nasi, is very much me being somewhere in the world and doing, I think, what many of us do, which is to go look for something beautiful and to try to find delight where it is. And I have to say, I'm a bit of a Tokyo-phile at this point in my life. I've gotten to stay in the city for extended periods a couple of times now. And it's a place, I'm sure many of you have been, but Japan is a place that immediately takes you to a different world and to a different series of aesthetics and patterns and variations on patterns, and yeah, it's just a very deeply aesthetic experience, is what I'm trying to say, in so many aspects. So this poem is called Taking Apart the Orange Kimono. In the basement of the vintage clothing store in Harajuku, kimono are hung like characters in old novels. Impressive, but not relevant. You can buy them for 2,000 yen or $20. The beauty of the fabrics alone draws me there. Indigo geometries of starlight, scarlet chrysanthemums redolent of spring. I'm shopping for color. New curtains to replace the heavy black drapes my tiny apartment came dressed in, as if it had been in mourning. But I have no time left for darkness. A January rain is falling steadily. Crowds pass under their umbrellas like a sea of somber jellyfish. I choose an orange kimono, printed with blue and yellow peonies. Perhaps it is rayon. It looks like something from the 1970s, mid-century modern, sex and parties. At home, I begin to take it apart, splitting the seam from the bottom up, surprised to discover that the stitches, even and perfect as they are, have been sewn by hand. Whose hands, I wonder? Whose hands do mine follow along this straight path, unlatching each orange stitch, their needle tightened? In some other decade, years slipping in and out between us, like the gauzy lining hidden in the collar, to come back to the original pieces. And what are those? Two. Still, I marvel at this simple discovery that all kimono, ancient or modern, are sewn by hand along a set pattern of 5 long strips of fabric, each seam a straight going, given shape only when draped over the shoulders of a woman or a man in infinite variations of fabric and size, differing through time in every way except in structure and design, in its being what it is. As in solitude, we might come to know our own history. 3. Moreover, I discover deeper secrets of kimono anatomy. When surgeon-like, I loosen the stitches of one folded seam to discover another, simpler seam beneath it, unfaded by the light, erect and raw-edged. This is the first binding, what sews pieces to their place. Understanding then the beauty of a kimono comes from seams that are twice sewn. First with this suture of necessity, as we are, made of days, bound to days, cleaved tightly along our edges. When we undo this seam, what happens? Or we come apart. But with what erotic mystery this seam is hidden by the second thread running under the edge of an amply gathered fold, discreetly and complexly stitched against the wide expanse of fabric, so that this second seam is not a joining so much as an obscuring that hides the evidence of assembly, as labia hides the dark entry to the womb, as all beauty hides a stark necessity. So that's the orange kimono. I find myself, I'm working on a series of essays about Japan, and I do find myself sort of immersed in what are, in a way, cultural cliches about Japan. And yet I find in all of these superficially cliched images, as in Kimono, these sort of infinite iterations, which is something about Japanese culture, which is about iterations and fractal repetitions of different concepts. So I was going to read one piece, but my darling mate, Mark, was saying, no, don't read that, read this instead. So the second piece is part of this series of essays about Japan that I'm working on. And this is when I'm in Tokyo, a little bit about this series. When I'm in Tokyo, I live alone, and because I don't really speak the language, I spend a lot of time in solitude and in a tiny little apartment. So I go to museums a lot, and there are hundreds of museums in Tokyo, and museums of every kind, and that's where I spend time. So of course, during this most recent virus, all the museums were closed, and the main library that's across the street from where I stay in Tokyo was closed. So suddenly I was tossed into having to visit gardens, which is, of course, another wonderful thing to visit in Tokyo. And this essay is about a garden. The garden is called Koishikawa Korakuen. That's the name of the essay. The museums are closed now because of the virus, so I go to the gardens. Koishikawa Korakuen is surrounded, like most of the old gardens in Tokyo, by skyscrapers, but never built over. It is as if the open green space of the gardens is also a permanent built structure, an eternal shelter without sides. Koishikawa was the name of the district. Korakuen translates roughly into hardship now and pleasure later. The lords of Mito, a branch of the Tokugawa shogunate, built the garden in the 16th century before the city was near. Now Tokyo Dome is next door. The roller coaster of the amusement park rises and curves in the sky, echoing the curving paths and artificial hills of the garden, which, as in many Japanese gardens, are built to resemble, in miniature, landscapes elsewhere, so that a small curved inlet of the lake represents a bay somewhere on the coast, and a hillock topped with stones, a mountain valley near Nagano. What is large becomes small, and what is new echoes what is old, like the voices screaming from the apex of the roller coaster, looping like time across the horizon. The garden is marked with a number of signs, each writing out a small story. The branching paths have names like "It Goes Through Plum Orchard," or "It Goes Through Plum Orchard," as if each phrase is a journey. I stand on the stone foundation of the shrine to Hitomaru, one of the patron saints of literature, burned down by the fire after the great Kanto earthquake of 1923, engulfed by the flames. The tea house, too, was destroyed by the bombs of World War II. There is a well, Furo no Mizu, whose waters were once believed to extend life. Mizu is water. I want to drink this water of youth. The well is a dark hole, just visible under leaning rock. Do not fall in, the sign warns. But what if I did and lived forever? Some plum blossoms are blooming, though they are not spectacular. An old couple sits on the bench by the trees and share a sweet from a small white bag. Has their life together been as quiet as this day? Something small, divided in a tranquil hour. I come to a sign that says, "When the beloved falcon with which the 7th lord of the Mito family was given by the shogun died, the 8th lord erected this monument." I'm suddenly grief-stricken, feeling, despite the centuries past, the enormous loss of this falcon. I am in awe of this cool, concrete city on this Saturday in the year 2020, which has for 400 years kept mourning all this time the death of the falcon. The tall black stone monument, inserted, it seems, like a wing into the earth, is inscribed with ancient letters that must mean fly or love. The edge of the stone is unpolished and jagged, like loss, I think, always an unfinished thing. I am moved. I take a seat on the bench by the lake. I write this: "How does a falcon fly? or sorry, I write this, how does a falcon die? Does it fade slowly or fall from the sky? Does it land from a final flight? Does it come home? Or simply ascend upward as on an intake of breath into the porous net of the sunlit air until it falls out of sight, erased like a letter from a white page, silence of the empty sky. How can anything bear to die, leaving us such a narrow path, a deep well covered over by stones, a downward calling, a nightfall? And what did the falcon know on his last flight? The delicate crane in the crane break, but not broken. A rabbit near the bridge, its watchful ear transparent, pulsing with a pink vein. The cherry trees blooming here are weeping cherries. The Lord who loved his falcon left a monument of mourning. Everything is made of pieces of other things. A wing is only made of feathers. Each part of this story is made from words that were in another story or another poem, as I hear now in Falcon, Robert Duncan's poem. My mother would be a falconress, and I, her gay falcon, treading her wrist, would fly to bring back from the blue of the sky to her, bleeding, a prize, where I dream in my little hood with many bells jangling when I'd turn my head. A poem I have always loved, though in my mind, it is always my mother who is the falcon. Her deep set eyes, her jet black hair, and I fly with her. But what is that all about? So that's my falcon poem. How are we on time? I have one other, I can stop there, or I have one.
Is it a short piece, Barb?
It's pretty short. I forget what it's about 4 minutes.
I think 4 minutes is good, and we'll end there.
Is that okay?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. It is more of a talky sort of piece about COVID that kind of brings us up to date with where things are. So this is something I wrote on my way home from Tokyo. I love the suggestion of the covert in the word COVID, hidden as it is in every corner of our paranoia. En route today from Tokyo back to the US, it's all these things that are missing that demonstrate its near presence. No flights were leaving from Tokyo, as I found out on arriving at the hauntingly abandoned international floor at Haneda, where a dozen impeccably dressed attendants in blue serge and pantyhose stood at attention in the empty hall. Japan Airlines fully staffed and at the service of an imaginary public. It's a quality I've come to love about the Japanese, a fundamental faith in all that is abstract and symbolic. They are serving. Whether or not there is anyone to serve is a whole other question. When one of the young women there saw me walking toward the empty gate, she approached me like you would a wounded animal in the wild, tentatively. London, she said hopefully. No, I answered, Chicago. She pointed to the sign showing the cancellation that had been made a few hours before. Because of the virus, she offered, as if perhaps I hadn't heard. My visa was about to expire, but more importantly, so was I. I've been in Japan for over 3 months, looking for solace in Japanese literature, a fool's errand if ever there was one. I read a lot of death poems, a genre known as jisei in Japanese, and basho, but even the narrow road to the deep north got too narrow. I plowed through decades of Japanese stories, unrequited love, fire, and suicide, until I too was ready for the same ending. One story in particular, Hell Scream, by Akutagawa haunted me. In it, a famous painter subjects his models to all manner of torture in order that he might paint more accurately the suffering of the Buddhist hell realms. Of course, he takes it too far, and in the final scene, with the flaming carriage that contains his beloved daughter, he too is forced to experience the worst thing he can possibly imagine. It's an exquisite piece and perfect for these times. What is the worst thing we can imagine? Staying home alone, dying, or something in between? In Tokyo, we went on with life up until a few weeks ago. I sat in cafes and restaurants reading of American friends in lockdown. My son sending me pictures of boarded up San Francisco, while I sent him pictures of crowds on the streets of Hiro. Stories were circulating about why Japan was being spared. Was it simply their acceptance of disaster, tempered by their knowledge of the fires, bombings that had decimated the city time and time again, and yet here it was. The concerned agent listened attentively as I described my visa situation. I could go to San Francisco, Atlanta, LA, I explained. Final destination, she asked. Seriously? I wanted to say, death, darling. But I didn't say it. She took from her breast pocket the hand-sewn ivory notebook and fine-tipped pen that every Japanese person is born with, and asked me the name of the city of my final destination. Charlotte, I said. She tried to spell it. S-H-A-R, no, I explained, C-H, as in Chicago. But that's not right either. C-H, I kept repeating. S-H, she kept writing. And for a moment, it seemed like the vagaries of English spelling were going to be the real issue after all, as the random nature of this spelling rule brought immediately into play the random nature of all things that are unknowable or anomalous. What is the actual issue at any given moment? Is it all in constant and unknowable flux? Just one more paragraph here, sorry. Meanwhile, my agent was still searching for a way to send me somewhere else. She led me across the empty lobby to a chair where she felt I could wait more comfortably while they searched. I took the chair as a bad sign. Look, I said, I'll go anywhere in America. I'll deal with it from there. I know how to drive. The Japanese like simple designs, but they love complex plans. The itinerary they came up with was so complicated that I thought at first they were joking. I would fly to one airport in Osaka where I would then get a bus to another airport 60 miles away. And from that airport, I would get a flight to LAX. And from there, eventually, hopefully, probably a flight would leave for Charlotte. And with a few delays in between, it worked. I got to fulfill the fantasy of stretching out across the free seats of an almost empty jumbo jet, dozing comfortably as we made our way across the night, across the ocean, thinking of the endless depths that are always around us, waiting for our notice. That's good. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Barbara, for that. I have to say, it's a little hard listening to these travel poems in this current state of things, you know. I can only imagine getting on a plane and going anywhere, much less Tokyo or Bali or anywhere like that. But I'm so glad you had the experience, that you were able to get out of Tokyo, because I think there was a point at which you were perhaps not going to make it.
Yes.
And Britt,
definitely, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that was one of the, not the last flight, but one of the very rare flights that were leaving Tokyo at that point. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you were able to get on it.
Me too.
And Britt, it was so nice to hear those new poems after having lived with the the work inside of Notwithstanding for the time I was putting it together and we were editing it and going through the proofs and everything. It's so nice to hear a fresh take on your take on quarantine and living in isolation and all of that. So thank you both so much.
Thanks, Thoreau, editor extraordinaire.
Thank you, Thoreau.
I think the work of small presses is really extraordinary, and yeah, once again, I encourage you all to support them, and I'm so grateful.
And I wanted to just say hello to some friends that I haven't seen for such a long time. It's so great to see George Quasha and Elizabeth Robinson, friends from far away, and Megan Simpson and John Phillips from very far away. It's really a pleasure to have you joining us. Thank you so much.
So we're going to unmute everybody at the very end so you guys can all say your hellos back to Barbara and Britt. So just give me a moment, another minute or two, and we'll be right at that point. But first I want to thank some other people, especially my fellow editor, Michelle Murphy, for all of her work on social media and beyond, and our two interns, Kelsey and Isabel from Sacramento City College. I really appreciate all the work they've been able to do for us. But mostly I want to thank you guys for coming and participating in this event and being supportive of the writers and of the press. I really do appreciate it. Like I mentioned at the beginning, you can get their books with a 15% discount now, at least through the end of May, using this promo code Kitchen Table 2. That's the number 2. Or just going to our website /discounts and you'll see all that all over again. So I hope you'll be able to join us for the next kitchen table reading, which is going to feature Michael's son, who I can see in front of me now. Michael, hey, who's going to be not reading from, but presenting his book of visible poetry called Still Forms. And if that intrigues you, you should definitely tune in. These are poems that are really meant to be looked at and not so much read. And that's either going to be on May 28th or June 4th. We're still trying to firm up that date. So now I'm going to unmute y'all, and everybody can say their hellos and their goodbyes. And I just wanted to thank you all for being here. So just give me a second. Unmute all. There you go. I think you should all be unmuted or on your way to unmute.
Hello, Timothy. So great to see you.
Thank you for those lovely readings.
Thank you.
Nice to have voices, other voices, very nice. So good luck with your work and carry on.
Thank you.
Nice to see you. We enjoyed it. It's our
Good. Great to see you, Megan. What are you all up to over in Pennsylvania?
Oh, I can't.
Wildlife.
Yeah, we're just unstoppable.
You're speechless. You're speechless.
Parties.
Social life.
Yeah, he's writing. Anyway, nice to see everybody. It was a really great reading.
Thank you. Thank
Enjoyed
you.
it. And it's nice seeing my old friends.
Yes. Hmm.
Yeah.
So we're also open for any questions or ideas or any other things anyone wanted to chat about. What is everyone reading and writing? I'm curious.
That was actually a question that did come through for both of you guys. What are you reading? What are you reading these days of quarantine and lockdown?
We've been exchanging books somewhat. I've been reading things and then rapidly foisting them upon others and saying, you have to read this, you must read this. I read Sigrid Nunez's The Friend.
I read that. That was fabulous.
I really enjoyed and gave that to Barbara to read. I read an exquisite novel called Miss Jane by a writer named Brad Watson. It was written a few years ago, and it's set in rural Mississippi beginning around 1915. And so it covers briefly the period of the flu epidemic in 1918. And it sort of, I loved Sigrid Nunez's book. I love books that are written by writers that seem to be, that are hard not to perceive as sort of thinly veiled memoir or autobiography. But Brad Watson's novel restored sort of my faith in the genre as an act of the imagination and an act of the compassionate imagination. Yeah, I can't recommend it highly enough. It's from the perspective of a child and then a young woman, an adult, born with an anatomical deformity in rural Mississippi 100 years ago, and it's beautiful. I'm always so impressed with writers who can cross back and forth between genres as Barbara does, and this is sort of a poet's novel. And similarly, I'm reading Sally Mann's memoir, Hold Still, and again, someone who has accomplished so much in visual art, who is also capable of
The one she wanted me to
writing is.
That's the one. About the photographer.
Yeah.
So and then as I mentioned,
just took it out.
Such a fun.
I'm sorry, I could go on and on. I'm sort of surrounded by a sea.
Yeah, it's easy.
I've gotten so excited about, again, because I'm at liberty to read them. I think we can sort of forget or force ourselves to forget, just how nourishing it is to read, because if we don't feel at liberty, we can sort of turn that part of ourselves off, and then when
we're on ahead to Mama.
Yeah, sure.
So George, what are you reading and publishing? Speaking of other small presses in the world. Oh, you're not. We need to unmute you.
I'm trying to unmute him, but it won't unmute.
Won't unmute. He doesn't want to speak.
He may right. He may have. I don't know, but I can't do it.
Okay.
I did it. It's
There
fine.
you go. All right.
Yeah.
Hey.
There you go.
Oh, too complicated a question. We're reading such a
Okay.
vast number of things and writing a lot, actually.
Good.
But it's wonderful to hear you read, really.
Oh, thank you. That's
Been
so
years.
good to see you guys.
Many years since.
Many, yes.
Yeah.
George lives, for those of George is an acquaintance from my days at Bard, a good friend of Robert Kelly's. He's one of the original editors of America Prophecy. I don't know if any of you remember that anthology. So important when I was a teenager. It was one of the books that led me sort of to poetry. And then that I would stumble upon George seemed very significant. So, it still is, George.
Well, wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. And yeah.
These are all the people that are listening.
Darling. Down your eye.
Yeah.
So anybody else want to say their goodbyes or their hellos?
I will
I'll say hey to Britt. I really like listening to her read anytime, and it was lovely to hear Barbara. I've never heard you read before, so it's always lovely to have a voice to go with the words. So thank you so much for doing this, both of you.
Thank you. Thank you. So great to have you, Floriana, though I can't see you.
Hi, Barbara. I'm here too, Adriana.
Oh, Adriana! I love you guys. I wish I could see you. And John Phillips, where are you tuning in from?
Slovenia.
Slovenia. So Floriana, we have two Slovenians in one
Oh, really?
Amazing.
Yeah. I enjoyed reading by both of you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
So I see, I'm sorry, I see that somebody's been trying to unmute themselves and say something.
Yes.
Oh, there you are.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Really?
Of course, I know Britt, but I don't know Barbara. Britt's mom is right here.
Oh.
And that was the cat's pajamas. What a delightful way to ease out of the day here. Thank both of you so much.
Thank you.
And Britt, I really like your new stuff.
Thank you.
I want to sit down with it now, pour over it. So thank you very much, all of you. What a treat.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You say this. Thank you. You liked it a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Okay, I think
Thank
we're
you
gonna
so
just turn it off here. So thanks again so much.
Thank you.
And we'll
Wonderful.
hopefully see you next time.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Yes.
Bye. Wonderful to hear you.
Nice to see you. Bye.